No one expected Adrian Whitmore to return that day. Not as security detail. Not the staff who maintained the estate's polished perfection. Not even Lucas Hale, the live-in caretaker and supposed friend. The iron gates creaked open under the morning sun as Adrian's black SUV rolled in without sound or ceremony. The only person who had known of his return was his assistant overseas, sworn to silence. Adrian didn't want welcomes. He wanted stillness. He hadn't touched the house since the funeral. The driveway curved past trimmed hedges and fountains that no longer brought him calm. In the back seat lay unopened gifts for his twin sons, items meticulously selected from his business trip, wrapped in navy and silver, untouched by fingerprints. But Adrian's real gift to them, he believed, was order, control, cleanliness, a world with straight lines and no sudden breaks. That was how Daniel would have wanted it, or so Adrian told himself. As the SUV pulled to a stop, Adrian loosened his tie, stepped out, and walked toward the courtyard. Each footstep echoed slightly on the stone. He missed them. Every cell in his body had ached for Ezra and Elijah during those sleepless hotel nights across the Atlantic. Now he was finally home. Then he froze. There, in the middle of the marble-tiled courtyard, his twin boys were giggling, soaked to the skin, splashing in a bright blue plastic tub that clearly didn't belong there. Water poured from a garden hose, arching like a fountain above them, turning the sun into scattered diamonds. It was wild, unscripted. Wet footprints trailed across his stone tiles. And kneeling beside the tub, shirt damp, sleeves rolled high, laughter in his throat, was Lucas Hale. Adrian's pulse tightened. That scene didn't belong in this house. He had left specific instructions before his departure: routines, guidelines, structured nap times, supervised play, and above all, decorum. Yet here stood Lucas, the man Daniel once called his safest place, turning the courtyard of a multi-million-dollar property into a suburban backyard. Adrian stepped forward, sharply. His voice didn't rise, he never yelled, but the authority in it struck like frost. "What is this?" he asked. Lucas looked up, surprised but not alarmed. Water dripped from his hair. He was smiling, still smiling, as if Adrian's presence didn't fracture the morning in two. The upstairs water was shut off temporarily. Lucas said calmly, "So I thought you thought this was appropriate," Adrian cut in. "This," he gestured, not at the boys, but at the mess, the tub, the puddles, the hose trailing across the floor like a forgotten toy. "Is this your idea of childcare?" Ezra and Elijah didn't seem to notice the tension. They squealed louder, slapping the water, shrieking with joy. For a moment, it made Adrian feel outnumbered. Lucas stood, brushing off his jeans. They got dirty playing outside. They needed a wash, and they needed to laugh. His tone wasn't defensive, just matter of fact. Daniel is gone." Adrian snapped, quicker, sharper than he intended. The words cut something deep. Lucas paused. "I know." And suddenly, Adrian hated how he said it. Not with grief, but with memory. As if he knew Daniel in ways Adrian never did. There was a silence between them, heavy and tight. In that space, Adrian looked at the children, his children, and for a second, he couldn't tell whether he was furious at Lucas or at himself. He turned on his heel and walked back toward the house. Behind him, the laughter continued, unfiltered, unconcerned. Daniel used to say that children needed freedom, like they needed food, that they deserved to be messy, to get things wrong, to feel joy without explanation. Adrian never understood that. Structure had always saved him from poverty, from chaos, from the heartbreak of being left behind. But in that moment, he felt strangely like the one intruding, like the stillness he craved no longer belonged here, and perhaps hadn't belonged for a long time. If you've ever tried to do everything for us, only to feel like you're still losing what matters most, this story is for you. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe to her stories for more stories that speak where words often fail. Adrian Whitmore had spent a lifetime controlling outcomes contracts, deadlines, margins. He had mastered the art of silence and negotiations, the precision of power, but none of those skills applied here. In a home that still smelled faintly of lavender and loss, he sat alone in the study, the sounds of dripping water echoing somewhere down the hall. His sons were laughing again, a few rooms away, and he couldn't tell whether it felt like healing or betrayal. The air conditioning clicked on, but it didn't cool the heat rising behind his collar. Lucas Hale. That name alone stirred something Adrian refused to name. Daniel used to talk about Lucas as if he were more than a person, more like a chapter of his life Adrian hadn't been invited to read. Adrian never questioned it. He was the one Daniel married, the one who signed the adoption forms, the one who held Daniel's hand during every appointment and later at the end, who held it through every beep of the hospital machine until silence filled the room. Adrian had been there. Lucas had not. So why now did Lucas walk these halls like he'd always belonged? The image of Lucas with the twins flashed again, kneeling, smiling, carefree. It grated against everything Adrian had built. He rose sharply and left the study, shoulders tight with purpose, his polished shoes thudding softly across the floor. He found Lucas in the sunroom, towel drying Elijah's curls while Ezra traced letters into the fogged glass. The scent of warm soap and baby lotion lingered in the air. Adrian's presence stiffened the room. "What happened to rules?" Adrian said, voice measured but low. "To boundaries, to respect." Lucas looked up, meeting his eyes with the calm of someone who had nothing left to prove. "Respect is exactly why I did what I did." Adrian's brow twitched. Lucas continued. They were covered in dirt. The water upstairs was off. The sun was out. So I gave them 10 minutes of joy. It wasn't about breaking rules or some. It was about giving them what they need. What they need, Adrian echoed coldly, is structure, not chaos. "No," Lucas said quietly. "What they need is to be seen, heard, let in, not just managed." A pause, boom. Then Lucas reached into his back pocket and pulled out something wrapped in aging plastic, a folded envelope. Yellowed at the edges, he held it out with both hands. "It's from Daniel," he said. Adrian hesitated, but took it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. The ink was slightly smudged in parts, like it had been handled more than once. Inside, Daniel's looping script stretched across a single page. "If you're reading this, it means I'm not around anymore. If I'm gone, Lucas is likely still near, and I hope he is. Please, Adrian, don't cage our boys in grief or in your fear of losing control. Let them live. Let them laugh. Let Lucas remind them what joy looks like when it isn't afraid of being too loud." Adrian folded the letter slowly, jaw tight, knuckles whiter than before. Lucas didn't speak again. He didn't gloat, didn't demand understanding. He simply placed Elijah gently on the playmat and said, "If you want me gone, say so. I'm not here for me. I'm here because Daniel asked me to be. If you believe I no longer belong, I'll pack my things." He stood and waited, but Adrian said nothing. Not because he agreed, not because he disagreed. Because in that moment, something inside him, something carefully guarded, shuddered. Lucas turned and walked toward the hallway, disappearing around the corner without waiting for a verdict. Alone again. Adrian looked down at his hands, still holding Daniel's words like an indictment and a lifeline. He didn't notice Ezra quietly toddling over, placing a damp plush toy in his lap and leaning against his leg without saying a word. Grief had 1,000 disguises. For Adrian, it had always worn a suit. It had always spoken through silence. But watching Lucas today had torn open something inconvenient, something messy, a realization, perhaps, that Daniel had always known Adrian would try to do everything right, even when right meant cold. There is a danger, sometimes, in believing that control is love, but love, real love, lives in the imperfect. It plays in the dirt. It lets children laugh too loud. It forgives puddles on polished floors. And sometimes it trusts a letter more than a rulebook. Adrian Whitmore hadn't touched his late husband's study since the funeral. The room had remained as Daniel left it, books arranged in a language of order only he understood, A half-finished sketch pinned to the wall, the faint smell of cedar and ink lingering like a whisper. It was here that Adrian now stood, the letter from Lucas still trembling in his fingers, its weight somehow heavier than paper should allow. He hadn't opened this door in over a year. The room had been sealed like a vault, a place of memory too volatile for someone like Adrian, who coped by shutting drawers and straightening frames. But now the old floor groaned beneath his shoes as he stepped inside, holding the letter close to his chest like something fragile. He sat at Daniel's desk, running his palm across the worn surface, and opened the envelope again. The letter was dated the week after the twins were born. "If you're reading this, Adrian," it began, "then I've broken our promise. I told you I'd be around to raise them with you. I told you we'd get through this. I'm sorry I lied." Adrian closed his eyes, breathing through the tightness in his throat. "You will try to do it all alone. I know you, Bella. I love you because of that. And despite that, you'll raise them like they're fragile glass, and that will come from love. But they are not glass. They are fire. Let them burn bright. Let Lucas remind you." That name again? Daniel hadn't written it as a warning. He'd written it as trust. Adrian folded the letter again, more gently this time, and placed it beside an old photo frame lying face down on the desk. Turning it over, he found a picture of the three of them, Daniel, Lucas, and himself, taken long before the marriage, before the adoption, before the grief. In the photo, Daniel stood between them, his arm resting casually on Lucas's shoulder, his other hand linked with Adrian's, smiling, always smiling. Adrian hadn't noticed the subtle geometry of that image before, the way Daniel's eyes lingered on Lucas, not as a slip, but as something unspoken. The truth had always been there, but Adrian had never needed or wanted to name it. Lucas had known Daniel before the plans, before the contracts, before the polished version of life Adrian helped him build. Maybe that was why Daniel trusted Lucas with the one thing he wouldn't be around to protect. Later that evening, the house fell quiet as the twins drifted off to sleep. From the hallway, Adrian saw the soft glow of the nursery lamp, its light brushing over the edge of the crib, casting long shadows on the wall. Lucas was there, kneeling once more, his back to the door. He was humming quietly, tenderly, a lullaby Adrian hadn't heard since Daniel sang it himself in the hospital room. Cheeks hollow, voice faint. Adrian didn't enter. Instead, he returned to the sunroom where the confrontation had happened that morning. The plastic tub was gone. The tiles had been scrubbed clean. Not a trace remained of the mess that had so rattled him, only the lingering scent of soap and the faint, ghost-like outline of wet footprints, now dried. He stood there, alone, until something caught his eye. Beneath the bench, tucked in a canvas bag, was another envelope. This one wasn't sealed, just folded, softened by time, with Daniel's handwriting once again on the front. Different ink, older. He hesitated, then unfolded it. To Lucas, it read, "If something happens to me and Adrian forgets how to smile, please stay. Please help him remember. No conditions, no legal jargon, just a plea." And suddenly Adrian understood what Lucas had never said. He had never come to replace. He had come to preserve, not only the twins' joy, but the memory of Daniel's love in its rawest, most unfinished form. Back in his room, Adrian placed both letters in a box marked Daniel and shut it carefully, not to hide, but to keep safe. That night, lying awake, he watched the ceiling as if it held answers. Outside, he could hear the hush of wind through the trees and the occasional creak of a house that had started to breathe again. Sometimes what remains is not what we plan, but what we trust others to carry for us. Daniel had trusted Lucas with the future Adrian was too scared to imagine, and perhaps trust, not control, was what love truly looked like. Once grief was quiet enough to hear it, night settled over the Whitmore estate with a quietness that felt earned. The twins had been fed, bathed, and tucked into bed hours earlier, their soft breathing now the only sound coming from the nursery. In the hallway, a sliver of warm light spilled from under their door, like a gentle reminder that something still pulsed and lived in this house despite all that had been lost. Adrian Whitmore stood just beyond the threshold, watching without stepping in. Elijah had curled against Ezra, their arms tangled the way only children slept without boundaries or fear. On Ezra's cheek was the faintest flush of red, a sun-kissed souvenir from the earlier water play. His hair, still slightly damp, curled at the edges. Adrian didn't smile, but something behind his ribs softened. He had once believed that love was protection, that the more he controlled, the safer they would be. But control had made the house sterile, quiet, a museum of a life no longer lived. And watching his sons now, it became impossible to deny they hadn't looked this alive in months. He turned from the nursery and returned to his room. The space was pristine as always, curtains drawn at exact lengths, shoes aligned at the foot of the closet, surfaces free of dust. He reached for the switch on the bedside lamp, but stopped short when he noticed the photograph. It had fallen from the edge of his dresser. He picked it up, expecting another picture of the twins, or perhaps a formal portrait of him and Daniel at some gala. But this was different. It was older. The photo had been taken at a university graduation. Daniel, younger, beaming in his gown, arms around another man. Lucas. They weren't just standing together. They were holding each other. Not casually, not like friends posing for a memory. There was something in their eyes unguarded, raw. Lucas's hand rested over Daniel's heart, and Daniel's gaze, usually playful in photos, was serious, grounded. Adrian sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the frame. The glass had cracked slightly at one corner. He had never seen this photo before. Not in the albums that Daniel left. Not among the files Lucas had digitized for safekeeping. This one had been tucked away, hidden. Perhaps, or simply, forgotten. A truth rose quietly in his chest, unwelcome but clear. Daniel had loved Lucas, not just as a friend, not just as a chapter long closed, maybe not even as something that ended, but he had chosen Adrian to marry, to raise a family, to share a life. That choice had been real, but it had not erased the past. And now, Adrian had to ask himself a question that felt like it had waited years for his attention. Had he ever truly wanted to know the full story? He walked to the window and looked out across the estate. The courtyard where the boys had splashed in the plastic tub earlier that day was still faintly damp, the moonlight catching the sheen on the stone. A few stray toys lay near the edge of the garden bed, things he would have demanded be cleaned up immediately. Before, now he let them be. Downstairs, the sound of a chair being pushed back in the kitchen reminded him he wasn't alone. Lucas had stayed up late, finishing the twins' laundry or prepping for tomorrow's meals. He always did. Adrian knew this, not because he asked, but because things were always quietly done. He sat, again, the photograph now in his lap. Daniel had loved two men, one he had built a life with, the other he had trusted to hold it if that life ever broke. And perhaps what unsettled Adrian most was the realization that this didn't diminish anything. It expanded it. The idea that love could have layers. That loyalty didn't mean pretending the past never happened. It meant protecting the people who still remained. Adrian had always feared that letting anyone else close would make him less of a father. That sharing space with Lucas Daniel's history would blur the roles, would dilute his authority. But maybe fatherhood, like grief, wasn't about roles or perfection. Maybe it was about presence, about learning, even too late, that there are different ways to hold a promise. He looked once more at the photo, then slid it carefully into the drawer beside the bed, not to hide it, but to preserve it. Then he turned out the light. In life, we are often taught to choose right or wrong, love or loyalty, past or future. But sometimes the wisest thing we can do is make room for and to honor what came before while still building what comes next. To protect the joy of children without shutting out the joy of memory. And to know that sometimes the frame has to fall for us to finally see what's been inside all along. The next morning came quietly. The kind of stillness that slips into a house when something important is about to shift. Sunlight poured through the east windows, touching everything with a pale gold. The twins were already awake, their laughter faintly echoing from the backyard where Lucas was helping them plant small flower bulbs in the dirt. Their tiny hands were covered in soil, their cheeks pink with joy. Lucas crouched beside them, guiding without correcting, letting them get messy, letting them live. Adrian Whitmore stood at the edge of the patio doors, watching through the glass. He hadn't spoken to Lucas since the night before, not directly. Not about the letter, not about the photograph, not about the truth that had quietly rewired his understanding of everything as husband, his children, and the man who had never left. But he knew it was time. He stepped outside. The air smelled like earth and morning dew. Lucas looked up when he heard footsteps, standing as Elijah clung to his leg, eyes curious. "I'd like to speak with you," Adrian said. His voice was calm, not commanding, just real. Lucas nodded, brushing soil from his hands. He told the twins he'd be right back and followed Adrian into the sunroom, the same room where a confrontation had once bloomed between them like a storm. But today, the tension was different. Not sharp, just unfinished. Adrian didn't waste time circling around it. "I know," he said. "I know you and Daniel had a story." Lucas's posture didn't change, but something flickered in his face. He waited. Adrian continued. "I don't know how long it lasted or how it ended, but I know Daniel loved you. And I also know he chose me. Not because you weren't enough, but because he believed I was the right one to build the life he wanted for them." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "You've stayed not because you wanted to relive the past, but because Daniel asked you to protect what he loved most." Lucas's gaze dropped for a second. Then he nodded. "I didn't come back to replace you, Adrian. I came back to keep my promise." "I know," Adrian said, "and I'm asking you to stay. Not for Daniel, not for obligation, but because we need you. They need you." The words settled into the room like a long exhale. For the first time in years, the house felt balanced. Not fixed, not perfect, but whole. Outside, the twins were now racing after a butterfly, their laughter rising into the morning air. Lucas smiled faintly at the sound, and Adrian did too. A few moments later, they joined the boys outside. Ezra pointed proudly at the dirt-covered bulbs, announcing he'd planted a rainbow garden. Elijah held up a worm and declared it a new pet. Lucas didn't flinch. Adrian surprisingly didn't either. They sat down in the grass together, Adrian on one side, Lucas on the other, both with their sleeves rolled, both leaning in, both watching the children as the water hose began its familiar arc across the lawn. The twins squealed as the spray hit them unexpectedly. Water droplets danced in the sunlight. Someone laughed first. Adrian thought it was Lucas, but then realized it was him. It had been so long since he heard that sound in his own voice. They let the boys play until their clothes were soaked and the grass was a mess. No one barked instructions. No one worried about clean floors. For once, Adrian didn't reach for a towel or a clock. He just let time pass. And as they sat there, water glistening on blades of grass, laughter rising like music through the air, Adrian whispered not to anyone in particular, but maybe to Daniel. Wherever he was, they're okay. We're okay. Because they were And sometimes healing doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it takes the shape of a letter, a photo, a forgotten friendship that never really ended, or two men sitting side by side, raising children in the only way that matters and with love that doesn't need explanation. In the quiet moments after grief, what helps you heal control or connection? Let us know in the comments. Your voice might speak to someone still learning how to let go. For more heartfelt stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories, where every story reminds us what love, loss, and second chances truly mean.